I am going to hand over to Julia, who is going to put our first question that we have for General Gibson to the General.
So, what have been some of the highlights of your extensive career in the intelligence and why?
Okay, well, thanks. That's a great question. And I hope I don't take too long answering this. You know, I did serve for 33 years in uniform and have remained active in national security circles since my retirement last year. I will tell you, my military career was a complete accident. I thought that I was going to be a scientist or an engineer. I actually have an engineering degree from Purdue University, but I paid my out-of-state tuition with an Army ROTC scholarship, and that's a program in the United States where the military pays for 4 years of tuition and books, and in return, you owe 4 years of active duty service once you get your degree. And, you know, when you're young and time has not yet begun to fly by, 4 years seems like a really long ways away. And in fact, so far away that it might almost feel like it's not actually going to happen to you, sort of like wrinkles and gray hair. That's something that will happen to someone else. It's never really going to happen to you. And so, you know, I went through the program. I wasn't seriously thinking about the military until all of a sudden I found myself almost in a sense of panic, driving up to the gates of Fort Huachuca, Arizona, which is where we train our intelligence, Army intelligence officers, in January 1987. And I thought, oh my gosh, what have I done? This is real. It's about to happen. This is serious. It's not something that I can readily back out of. This had better work out. 33 years later, I looked down at my uniform on the stage at my retirement ceremony, all these stars, a lot of bling. And I thought, how did this happen? I was only going to do 4 years and then I was going to get out and begin my life as a civilian. But it turned out that a career, a military intelligence career, a career in our U.S. Army was both exceptionally challenging and fabulously rewarding way to spend one's life. And I really have not found anything I would rather be than an American soldier. Still haven't. So why did I choose military intelligence? Well, as a cadet, when you're in college, learning about the Army, you're learning very basic things, you know, the principles of war, a little military history, principles of leadership, the structure, rank, and organization of the Army, small unit tactics, platoon and below. And there weren't a lot of women. There still aren't a lot of women. And but most of the women went into career fields like logistics, transportation, supply, maintenance, or what we call adjutant general, which is, you know, kind of taking care of people, or the medical service corps. But I was really drawn to the tactical aspects of, you know, where should we put our machine guns? What's the avenue we think the enemy's going to approach? You know, where might we put forward observers for artillery? And at that time, the only way for a girl to get inside the tent where those decisions were made, the Tactical Operations Center, was one of two ways. You could choose to be an intelligence officer, or you could be a signal officer, communications. And if you were the signal officer, you were actually probably crawling around under the tables in the TOC, plugging things in and making sure the radio and the computers worked. But if you were an intelligence officer, you got to lean over the map board with the commander and the chief of operations and assess the battle, see what the adversary was going to do, plan the next day's operations. And that's where I wanted to be. So I chose military intelligence. In my first assignment, I went to Alaska, which was amazing for a girl from Montana who loves the outdoors. It was skiing, snowshoeing, glacier training, rappelling out of helicopters on a rope, building snow caves, and learning basic lieutenant stuff, you know, how to run a range, how to be a convoy commander, you know, the role of the non-commissioned officer, investigating missing property and figure out who ought to pay for it. And I fell in love with being a soldier, but I had not yet begun to practice the craft of intelligence. I mean, we would go to the field and do the basics, but, you know, even with our radio intercept equipment, you were just listening to other Americans on encrypted radios. So I was not yet performing intelligence. My next assignment, I went to Hawaii which was a great transition from Alaska to Hawaii. And I was assigned at the National Security Agency, which is like your GCHQ. In fact, they work closely together, a National Security Agency unit in Hawaii. And I went there kicking and screaming because I still wanted to be out in the woods, tromping around the jungle. And I did not want to go to this upper echelon kind of strategic assignment. But it was very, very good for me. And eventually I fell in love with this as well. We worked out of a 3-story building that was underground on Oahu, up on a hill. You had to walk about a quarter-mile up this tunnel to get into the building. It had originally been constructed in World War II as a place where they were going to build aircraft engines and then roll them down the hill, you know, through the tunnel to the airfield to smack on some wings. And, you know, this way they could construct aircraft safe from being bombed by the Japanese. It never really saw operation, and decades later, NSA said, we'll take that. And so I worked inside this underground building. If we had a fire drill, you had to go up the hatch at the top and pop out in a Dole pineapple field, literally, and then trek your way down through the orange dirt to the pineapple field and wait for the fire trucks. But this is where I began to do intelligence. And so we would monitor the communication systems of adversaries in Korea, China, perhaps things going on in the Philippines, and report that. We had a little phone booth. It literally looked like a little phone booth, not one of yours, not red, but like an American one, like Superman would go in, that had a special phone that we could talk to reconnaissance aircraft, so that as we would monitor adversary air defense systems, if we saw a radar lighting up, we could run into the booth, use a little code book, and tell the aircraft that, you know, they were being tracked. Tensions began to heat up between China and Taiwan. This was back in 1995, 96, and the Chinese started to lob missiles into the Taiwan Straits. I was a watch officer at night, QCing and approving SIGINT production reports that would go out, pages long, the distribution list of who it would go to. But I noticed that one of those on the list was White House, and I was pretty excited. I'm embarrassed to tell you how many years it was until I figured out this doesn't mean the president actually sees what you have done. But it, you know, just the fact that I was working on real intelligence and producing something that would actually be used by a decision maker, this is when I fell in love with intelligence. I won't go through every assignment in my career. I had several in the DC area. I ended my career working for the Director of National Intelligence, who heads our entire intelligence community. I had a job at the Joint Staff. I did 2 stints on the Army staff. I can tell you I did not enjoy a single assignment that I had at the Pentagon. I was just really marking time in all of those jobs. It was good quality family time, but I found working within the institutional bureaucracy to be very frustrating. It's important, and we need bright people to work there. I did not find the work appealing. What I really enjoyed was being inside the tent where the decisions were made, bent over the map board with the commander, advising him on his plans. And so this really happens, in my mind, and most comes together at the operational level of war. And those were my very favorite assignments. Yes, they do intelligence in Washington, D.C., but you're very removed from the fight or the decision makers and rarely see or interact with what some call the customer. And yes, it happens at the tactical level as well. But at the operational theater level of war is really, I think, where we bring to bear the entirety of our intelligence community, as well as our intelligence interactions with close allies and coalition members to bear, bringing it with the insights of the battlefield all together in one place very powerfully. And it is a real thrill to work at that level. I'll just give you a couple stories, some illustrations of what I'm talking about. I had an assignment. I ran the Combined Joint Intelligence Operations Center in Kabul in Afghanistan for the NATO mission there. At the time, General Joe Dunford was the commander. He later became our chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and his deputy was General Sir Nick Carter, who some of you may know. I interacted with him on a regular basis. That was sometimes a challenge of its own. He's a very bright man and has his own sources of intelligence. And I had a little team of about 150 people that represented most intelligence disciplines that would do analysis and intelligence production to meet the needs of General Dunford, General Carter, and their staffs, focused on fusion and analysis. I had teams that came and augmented us from our NSA, our NGA, the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, DIA, et cetera. And as an example, the NGA analysts, geospatial intelligence, absolutely loved it. Most of them came from either the NGA headquarters in Washington, D.C., or there's a huge NGA presence in St. Louis, Missouri. And if you're not that familiar with American geography, that's pretty much in the middle of the country. It is very far from all the warfighters, the policymakers, whether that's foreign policy or national security, who might be using their products. You do not get to see or interact with the people that you are supporting. You might get a note back that says your image was put into the read book of so-and-so. And a real bonus if it comes back with a note that says, Assistant Secretary Jones read your product with interest. And that's about all the feedback you will ever get. Now you're sitting side by side with people who are going to meetings with planners, you are interacting with, General Dunford would come into our little skiff once a week to sit down with the analysts. And a favorite memory of mine was there was a big truck of explosives we were tracking that the Taliban were going to try to sneak into Kabul. And I remember our chief of operations, General McFarland, standing behind the imagery analysts, hands on his knees, looking over his shoulder, saying, put the red arrow here on the map that shows the route that they're going to bring the truck in. And then he slapped him on the back. He said, hit print, I'm taking that to Karzai. He was going to take it to see President Karzai at the palace. And for this analyst who had never even met any of his customers, to be that kind of interacting and to see where the rubber meets the road was quite a thrill. And this is part of why I enjoy working at that echelon. My very favorite assignment ever was a Combined Joint Task Force Operation Inherent Resolve. That was a multinational coalition. The UK was an important part of that. To defeat ISIS, the physical caliphate in Iraq and Syria. I was forward for 13 months for that. I reflect on why this was the best year of my career. It was a clear mission. It was a very worthy cause. There was no doubt that what we were doing was righteous. We were making satisfying progress as we fought up the Tigris River Valley to situate ourselves for a 10-month campaign to liberate the city of Mosul. In the meantime, over in Syria, we liberated Manbij, we liberated Raqqa. We continued to clear terrain in northern Syria until we had Daesh or ISIS reduced to a tiny pocket in the Baghouz cliffs on the banks of the middle Euphrates River. Tremendously satisfying. And it was a multinational force. I had a British deputy. I was heavily reliant on intelligence from the UK Sentinel platform, if you're familiar with that. I think I was probably the biggest fan. I got great intelligence from Australian Special Operations. I got unmatched human intelligence from my counterpart in Jordan, who understood the tribal situation far better than any American force ever would. I had Polish analysts who could advise us on some more strategic developments regarding Russia, because Russia, of course, was heavily involved in Western Syria. And I had an amazing team from Singapore, we called it the Singapore PED team, that did very exquisite imagery analysis to support target development for our strategic bombing campaign. It was all hands on deck. My representatives from national agencies were absolutely about the mission. When you start working with the national agencies back in the States, back in DC, there's a lot of arm wrestling and bureaucratic hassles as you are trying to accomplish things, yet it may compete with institutional equities. I do not find that to be the case when you're forward in theater. Really, everybody is all about the mission. And it was also, there were several times when we were able to scoop the national intelligence agencies out there, and we were making assessments that the rest of the community, frankly, was relying on about, where is ISIS's new headquarters? As we liberated Manbij, moved to Al-Bab. We were the ones that called that Qasem Soleimani had an Iranian-backed militia team heading down the road to attack our position at Atanf garrison on the Syrian-Iraqi border, hoping for Russian air support. My little team, I had about 5 people that put the pieces together and solved that. That for me was a real career highlight. It was not without its challenges. Unfortunately, the results of the air campaign left the countryside in a worse condition than before the war began. And I scrutinized every target that went through the Joint Target Coordination Board with that in mind, really trying to minimize collateral damage. But of course, there was considerably damage, especially in some of the urban battles. We failed, utterly failed, really, I think, to address the underlying conditions that had allowed ISIS to flourish in the first place. And we've left behind a large radicalized population that still have a little ISIS fire burning in their hearts. You know, most of those folks are in places like the Al-Hol refugee camp that the Kurds are struggling to control. So, you know, again, it was not without its challenges, but it was tremendously satisfying. And I'm sorry I've taken so long with that, but it is hard for me to distill down in a short period of time what made a 33-year career so utterly fascinating and rewarding. Thank you.
Yeah, I'd hear you talk about it all night if we could. It's very, very interesting. I'm sure I speak for many of us as students at King's. When we read about these things in textbooks, it's very interesting to hear someone who's lived them talk about them. So thank you. I think, Julia, you have another question for the General.
Yeah. In an article we read, you said that one of the major problems for intelligence collection is culture rather than technology. Also, you said that the security environment requires instant and wholesale changes, while changes in culture might be very hard to make, as culture is typically the major impediment to policy change. Which kind of cultural improvement would you suggest so that the security field can benefit from it?
Yeah, so I'll highlight a couple that are largely about intelligence, but they probably extend to certain other parts of our national security enterprise, particularly probably targeting. And most of the change is driven by improvements in technology. So the first one I would highlight is that the government no longer has a monopoly on exquisite collection or even advanced analytic techniques. As you look at the proliferation of commercial satellite capabilities, commercial imagery capabilities, and then the kind of big data analytics that is done by, you know, companies in Silicon Valley and elsewhere, means that the government, the intelligence community, no longer has the lead on some of these capabilities. And then the third one I'd add is on the ground perspectives, in particular for the United States, as we, you know, withdraw our presence in certain nations or in others where our ability to travel freely is rather restricted. You know, I think of places where we have defense attaché offices in Islamabad or Baghdad or Kabul, you know, but it's not like you can just roam the countryside and make observations. Another reason that our insights, our human insights, are somewhat challenged is increasingly, imagine what it's like to deploy a covert operative to a nation where now we all come with a digital trail that is very hard to erase. And then finally, the democratization of information means that many people outside the intelligence community have the information that we need. When I was the J2, the senior intelligence officer at U.S. Central Command, which is responsible for U.S. military operations from Egypt to Pakistan, Yemen to Kazakhstan, I had actually Euronews playing on the big screen in my office, and I'd be working on something. I'd look up, oh, hey, something exploded in Damascus. I'd call the jock and be like, hey, something, figure out what it is. We're not learning about those kind of incidents from sensitive intelligence collection. In fact, I used to tell my analysts, if you're going to sit in the skiff and think you're going to just follow highly classified information, you're going to be the last one to know what's going on, because typically these developments, kind of I&W things, break in the open press. So what does this mean? It means that the intelligence community needs to embrace and leverage commercial information and unclassified information. And as the quantity of that kind of stuff becomes increasingly available, I think it really raises an existential question for the American intelligence community. Is the IC really about the collection, synthesis, and correlation of data and information to provide insights for planning and decision, regardless of where that information comes from? Or are we just about acquiring covert, exquisitely collected niche information that's not otherwise available? I think if that's the route we go down, our days are numbered, because all of this other information is available in other means. So that is a challenge for the intelligence community that requires a change in cultural mindset. The further you get from the flagpole, the easier it is Frankly, when I was in Iraq and Syria, my boss, Lieutenant General Townsend, he might turn to me and say, hey, Gibson, tell me what's going on with the Syrian opposition, or what's Turkey up to in northern Iraq, or, what's this going on with the Kurdish separatist movement? And he never added, oh, by the way, I'm only interested in classified information. He just wanted the answer, right? He doesn't care where it comes from. And so I would tap considerably into unclassified information. You move closer to Washington, D.C., you get a much stronger aversion to touching classified and a much greater tendency to overclassify things. So I'll give you another example. It was after battles in the lower Euphrates River Valley, Ramadi and Fallujah. This would be 2016, and the CIA did a fantastic report on how the Iraqi security forces had fared, their strengths, their weaknesses, et cetera. It was really one of the most best, sometimes something can be too big, it's not useful, or it was Goldilocks, it was just right. It was a great, useful product. And it had about darn near every caveat, security classification across the top that you could imagine. Because they had thrown in a few paragraphs of, TS or HCS or other highly classified stuff. And they presented this very proudly to my boss, General Townsend, in the little CIA skiff in the embassy in Baghdad. And he looked at it and he tossed it back across the table. And he said, this product is absolutely no use for me, because I need to put this in the hands of the officers who are advising the Iraqis. And I'm not allowed to take it out of this room. So, at heart, I think there are a couple reasons that lead, especially the CIA, to do this overclassification. Well, other national agencies do it too, frankly. One, a lot of analysts think they're writing for the president. And much of their stuff does go to the president. But this information was of no use to the president. I wouldn't give this information to the 4-star in Tampa, who was responsible for CENTCOM. This information needed to go in the hands of the people who are working every day with the Iraqis. It really needed to be secret level and below. A second reason, besides everyone thinks they're writing for the president, is there's kind of a tendency of, I don't know if you'll know this expression, CYA. Does anyone know what I'm talking about if I say CYA? I don't see any thumbs up. Well, I see one head nod. Okay, well, I'm sorry for the crudity. It stands for cover your ass. So a tendency to a fear that if something bad happens, and they turn to the intelligence community and say, why didn't you tell us about this? Why didn't you warn us? And you want to be able to say, I put it in there. So there's a tendency to put everything I know, maybe it's kind of like writing a grad school paper, put everything I know in this paper just in case. A real art of intelligence is whittling it down to what's essential. So it's a bit of a CYA there. And then the third reason I would say, and this is a cultural reason, there's this sense that the more caveats it has on it, the sexier it is and the better it would be. And I would say this is less and less the case in the future. And that's not just a problem with the intelligence community, it's the part of the customers. So we got to change their culture too. They go, ooh, TS, SI, rattle off all the little letters at the top. This must be really good. I would like to have, again, an American expression. I don't know if this will mean anything to you, like the Pillsbury Bake Off. I would like to take a team of analysts that's allowed to tap everything, every piece of classified information in the world, and another that I say, you're just going to use what's unclassified or commercially available, maybe secret and below, and give them the same time window and the same problem and see what they put out. And how many new paragraphs are in the highly classified one, and is the unclassified one good enough? And I'd also append to it the price tag. How much did it cost to produce each one? If I could do that for like a year and give decision makers and policymakers both of them, I think it would be very eye-opening. Okay, so I rattled on a lot about that one. Here's a second cultural change. Artificial intelligence, big data, we are drowning in data. We live in an infinite world. We collect more than we can process more than we can analyze, we analyze more than we can write products on, and we produce more products and stick them in read books than anyone could read, digest, and remember. A particular area that cries out for an ability to cull through all this data is full motion video exploitation, staring at video that's coming off of drones. The US Air Force, it bothers me as both a taxpayer and a manager of human capital, how many man hours are spent every day by people, usually airmen, staring at screens, waiting for someone to walk out of a building or something to happen. I want machines to do that. I want to be able to tell the machine, for today's mission, I want you to look at these buildings, and then at the end of the mission, replay the little snippets. We are limited to what the one pair of eyeballs can look at, and we may miss things they're not actually looking at. You say, it's great though, we stored it on the server, we can go back and look. We never have time for that because we suck up so much more than what we can really process. So I would like to free up manpower to do more challenging cognitive tasks. Well, that's a problem. Not everybody wants to do that. I've implemented this kind of change in organizations before, and sometimes when you ask people to, I'm going to free you up over here so you can do something that's more cognitively challenging, not everybody is eager to do that. It kind of removes the fig leaf, and you find out who can really think and who can't, who can really write and who can't. And we're asking to transform a giant Air Force enterprise that is full of people staring at screens. But that's one we need to do. And then the third one I would mention that's kind of related to that is trusting machines. So as we are increasingly culling through data and using machines to tell us what's happening, I say machines, big data analytics, think of like what Google and Facebook and others do. I hear, I can never trust a machine to tell me what's happening. It has to be a man in the loop. And I would say, yes, when it comes to, launch decisions, it will be a long time before, we don't want a man in the loop or a woman in the loop deciding about that. But, I drive a vehicle that has an electronic fuel gauge, an oil gauge, a speedometer, and I trust the machine. I don't get out and check the dipstick of my oil every day. I trust the machine there are many instances where we already trust machines. So this is a cultural change as we're moving into increasing machine analytics of digital information. And one reason some folks don't trust it is because digital information is potentially prone to manipulation or damage by adversaries in a way that things like my oil gauge perhaps is not. But that's another cultural change that we need to go through. So I hope that kind of scratches the itch a little bit on some of those cultural changes that we need to make in response to technological change.
Thank you, General Gibson. That's very interesting indeed. Just noticed there are some questions popping into the chat. Thank you for those. We'll get to the Q&A shortly after our third question. Do keep popping them in there. Things are definitely popping into my head. So keep putting your questions in and Rachel will read them. Julia, I think you've got one more question for General Gibson.
Yes. So the intelligence failure that led to the 2003 invasion of Iraq is often attributed, at least in part, to political pressures. Can you address the dangers of politicizing intelligence?
Oh my goodness, yes. So there's a lot to be said here. I would say, frankly, most politicization is not intentional. It is inadvertent. And I was not part of I was in Korea in 2003, and I was only a major. I wasn't part of that decision or that analysis. But I don't think anyone intentionally in the intelligence community, to include George Tenet, who was pounded on the table, intentionally politicized that information. But there are many things that can contribute to inadvertent politicization or skewing of intelligence, and I'll talk about those in a second. If you want to talk about what happens when you politicize intelligence. So separately, right now, I'm part of a task force in DC. It's called Task Force 16, as in January 6th. And we are looking at, on behalf of the Speaker of the House, Speaker Pelosi, what are ways that we can improve in the short term the security of the U.S. Capitol in the face of the 6th January insurrection. And I'm looking at the intelligence aspect of it. And yesterday I had a conversation that was really enlightening in terms of the challenges the U.S. Capitol Police have of couching what the threat is. Because with the increasing social unrest in the United States, whether it's for social justice or QAnon, pro-Trump folks, one group's threat community is another member's voting bloc. So you talk about politicization of intelligence. That definitely contributed to the failure to really see the threat of what was about to happen at the Capitol because of political pressures to downplay certain groups. Anyway, it's fascinating. But so in the military, though, we have tradecraft standards, training, ombudsman. We spend a lot of time training intelligence analysts to try to immunize ourselves from politicization. I don't think we do enough to train or educate the consumers, who are the ones that really drive a lot of the politicization. So it's not a new phenomenon. It's part of human nature. It's been going on maybe forever, and we have to guard against it continually. In 1950, the failure of the UN command under General MacArthur to catch on that the Chinese, A, were going to invade North Korea, and B, that they had crossed the Yalu River, was largely a result of politicized intelligence. MacArthur's intel chief, Willoughby, was a tremendous sycophant who'd been with MacArthur for a long time, and he knew MacArthur didn't like bad news, and he was in the habit of only giving MacArthur reports that he would like. So I often talk to, and they viewed as indicators began to come in of what China was about to do, they applied a filter. And, some of it was probably intentional and some of it was cognitive bias. No, that will never happen. We don't like that course of action. And it led to a significant intelligence failure in the Korean War. So I speak with commanders or future commanders at U.S. war colleges. I often talk about this and I say, you need to be careful about how you receive bad information, because a leader, whether they're political or military, who shoots the messenger every time they hear something they don't like or blows up or throws a tantrum, is over time going to bias the whole system, not just the intel team, from presenting him with news he doesn't like or bad news. And over time, you stop seeing the truth. So that's one facet of it. Another one that I see is commanders, and I've seen this the most in Afghanistan, who view intelligence reports as some kind of report card of themselves. And that's hard not to. It's human nature. And who will fight back then. When I showed up in Afghanistan in 2012, there was very much, I got there, they were in the habit of every CIA report that came out, they would write a rebuttal. And I felt like I was spending a third of my time rebutting CIA reports instead of doing our own analysis, because there was a series of commanders, and it started with Petraeus, who did not like the intelligence and saw it as some kind of report card. So I really think this politicization comes in large part, typically from pressure from a consumer. And it's not always blatant or intentional, but it can sneak into an organization. And so you have to be careful. I have several other examples of politicization, inadvertent, or, a desire to change the way things are being read from my own experience. But in the interest of getting to other questions, I'll kind of leave it at that.
Brilliant.
Okay. All right. I'll give you one more. So when I was in Iraq and Syria, it's really hard to work with the Kurds and not fall in love with them. And so, the people who worked most closely with them on the ground, I would say, I used to tell my boss, General Votel, back in Tampa, I'd say they drank the Kurdish Kool-Aid, or, they're in love with the Kurds, and this guy over here has a crush on them. And the Kurds are fantastic partners, right? But there were beginning to be some friction between the Kurdish and Arab elements of the Syrian defense forces that we were working with in northern Syria. And the Kurds didn't really want us to know. And so the CIA would put out, and others would put out reports that said, this is beginning to happen. And again, a commander on the ground, a one-star, who kind of saw it as a report card, or not just his, but, you're damning my Kurdish partners, who would fight against this and would tell his team to get out there and generate reports that are going to counter what the CIA is doing. And again, began to spend a lot of his time rebutting CIA reports. I was like, get over it. Just move on. You have a mission to do. It is not to fight the intel. And eventually I went to the CENTCOM chief of staff and I said, you really need to know. I mean, I think you kind of have an inkling, but so-and-so is losing his objectivity. And I was worried that even when we went into villages to meet with Arabs, we were meeting with Arabs that the Kurds introduced us to. We'd say, hey, we want to go to, whatever town, and the Kurds would arrange it. And so I wasn't sure we were really getting the full picture. So I went to my French counterpart and I said, first I went to the CIA and I said, who are your Kurdish sources and your Arab sources? And are they very different than ours? And it turns out they weren't, because the CIA was also being introduced to Arabs by Kurds. So I went to the French and I said, I would really like an impartial, independent assessment from your special operators of what you think is happening on the ground. And what I got back, they were great. And within a week, they generated a report, view from the ground. I thought it was far more objective, and I stuck that in my boss's book. So just briefly, I know the question was about politicization, but I do think it's critically important for decision makers, policymakers, military commanders to get multiple viewpoints. And, when they flip through their read book, they ought to see the logos of a bunch of different organizations in there. And I encourage, from coalition colleagues as well, who have different perspectives to help them make a more rounded decision. To prevent or to minimize some of that cognitive bias if everything you get is always from the same source. Okay, thanks.
Very, very interesting. Thank you, General Gibson. I think us Intel students are really eating this up. Speaking of, I'm going to hand over to Rachel, who's our Events and Outreach Coordinator, and she is going to be reading some of the questions that are popping up in the chat. Some of them are really, really good questions, ones I personally would love to know the answer to. So over to you, Rachel.
Yeah, I feel like we're getting more questions in the chat than we typically do for events, which I think just speaks for how excited everyone is to hear from you. So we have a couple questions on this topic. How efficient or inefficient do you think the U.S. intelligence structure is, and did the levels of bureaucracy hinder your ability to do your job?
Well, the answer is always going to be yes, right? So the question is how much? I mean, I've never met a bureaucracy that really facilitates, you're always, when you're on the pointy end of the spear, it'll feel like they're slowing things down. It kind of depends on where you are and what you're trying to do. I think when you're trying to do new things, the bureaucracy tends to get in the way. And again, it's often culture and policy. So I think back to, this isn't truly intelligence, but cyberspace operations, which I also had a number of assignments doing. And back in like 2005 to 12, if you wanted to, let me back up. You can take a private first class, some private straight out of basic training. He's manning a gate at some little camp, overseas. You give him a gun and a magazine full of ammunition, a deadly, rules of engagement, a deadly force brief, and he is authorized to take a human life if necessary in guarding that post, right? I mean, a private first class can choose to kill someone, or even lower ranking. But from like 2005 to 12, if you wanted someone to hit a Formula 404 error when they went to a website, that required permission from the Secretary of Defense. I mean, how skewed is that? Now, we're way past that now, but that was an example of a very risk-averse bureaucracy, an interagency bureaucracy, pushback from Department of State. Well, if we do that, someone might do it to us. Well, but the server is really in Malaysia. I know it's an ISIS website, but do we really want, so that's an example of a way that the bureaucracy can certainly get in the way. And the Director of National Intelligence has a tough job because there are 17 intel entities with very different equities and authorities. Herding those cats is very challenging. There are some areas where we do it well, but I do think we need to become more agile. I've been jealous of places like the UK that have like PGHQ, whereas we have all these combatant commands. Integrating across multiple combatant commands is hard. This morning, I heard a great presentation from the Israeli Defense Forces, and they were talking about all the things they have going on against their adversaries in multiple domains. And I thought, but you just have one command. If I was the size of New Jersey, I think my bureaucracy would also be easier to deal with. So, with our size, I think comes an increasingly complicated bureaucracy, and we really need to achieve better integration there. I don't feel like I really answered that question, but that's what I got.
Great. And then another question that Sarah and I are particularly excited about. What advice would you give female university students who are considering joining the military or making a career in the military?
Go for it. I mean, I think it's go for it. If you're interested, don't let it stop you. There are increased. It's never going to be 50%. Because in general, more men are interested in a career there than women, but there are tremendous opportunities, at least in the United States, in that field. In fact, okay, so our new director of national intelligence is Avril Haines. She's a woman, and just this week, no, the end of last week, she met with the chiefs of intelligence for our military services, Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, and now we have a Space Force. 4 of those chiefs, women. So in that group, there was one poor, lonely Navy man, and in 5 women as the chiefs of intelligence for the U.S. military and for our intelligence community. I talked early on about how, the only way for a girl to get in the tent and to be bent over the map board was to choose intelligence. I think this is part of, in fact, when I was the CENTCOM J2 and we had 10 combatant commands, half of them were women. And some of the tough meat-eating ones, CENTCOM, SOCOM, UCOM, SpaceCom, half of them were women. It is, in my nation, I think, a very good career field for women. So I say go for it.
I think that's such a good point. I think a lot of times we get afraid of the overall breakdown of gender, but when you go into the different categories, it's not as isolating as we might think.
Yeah.
So before you were talking about how powerful and relevant like unclassified sources can be for intelligence. How do you balance the ethical and moral implications of using intelligence from a citizen that could potentially put them at risk when their posts or videos are then put onto the national stage?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So we've got to work through that. That's, privacy, civil liberties is a challenge, I would say. But, when I was using open source, again, it's like having Euronews up on my screen and, oh, something just exploded in Damascus. There was a website, Syria Live Watch, that would show you all kinds of, overseas, I did not have to worry so much about US persons data. So what about AIS shipping data? That's unclassified. That gives us tremendous insight. And a lot of it isn't all US persons. So, I read an article about early on, maybe last April, May, early on in the COVID pandemic, that posited that the number of fatalities in Wuhan, China was way higher than the Chinese had reported. And it was a news organization that had used unclassified satellite imagery to track activity at crematoriums in Wuhan and saw that it had gone way up. That's unclassified information. So, there's all kinds of unclassified information that is not, personally identifiable data. We do need to work through that. And increasingly in the US, as our domestic terror threat is more likely to come from homegrown violent extremists than from radical Sunni jihadists. So for our law enforcement community and our constitutional protections, we do have to work through that. One of the potential challenges, I think, for us as coalition partners is that, we don't typically have any constraints about sharing geospatial intelligence products, as long as sensitive sources and methods have been protected. But different nations have different policies for personal data. That's going to complicate our ability to share unclassified information in a way that we're not complicated with other kinds of collected information. It would be as though, the Canadians all of a sudden said, I cannot look at any images of road intersections, or the Australians said, never send me green pixels because that violates our policies. So differing personnel security, how we treat personal data in unclassified data is a challenge. We can't, and we're still working through as a nation what that means, how to protect it. We can't wait to settle that policy to start embracing unclassified information. It's a great question. If you have bright ideas, that'd be something to help work on solutions for.
Great. And then we're kind of seeing like a shifting landscape in intelligence with like the increased cyber capabilities. What do you think the main impact has been on strategy making, and what do you see as the greatest challenge faced by the intelligence community in dealing with cyberspace in the future?
So cyberspace is, if you think back to like what NSA and GCHQ do, we're deeply embedded in getting intelligence in cyberspace. The tricky part is operations in cyberspace, not the intelligence aspect. So, I've used the one example of how long it took to become comfortable with, breaking someone's link to a website in the United States. It's the integration of it's cyberspace and we've kind of gotten past that in the United States, but that was an early hurdle for a long time. Just briefly, I'm sorry I keep using all these anecdotes. So I first started to touch cyber in probably about 2005. I was a battalion commander at Fort Meade, Maryland, which is where NSA is, NSA headquarters. And I had a tiny little detachment. It was called Detachment Meade. And it was, they did special purpose electronic attack. Well, later this little detachment grew to be the Army Net Warfare Battalion. And now it's our offensive, the Army's offensive cyber brigade, like hundreds of soldiers, maybe 1,000 soldiers. But back then it was so super secret. They wore civilian clothes. They went to a little, we put it in a corner, we put it far away, we hid it. When you sap something or protect it or treat it as super special, it is very hard to integrate with the rest of your operations. And I think that retarded our efforts to integrate offensive cyberspace operations with other operations for a decade or more. Now they're in the open, they wear civilian, or they wear uniforms, they're acknowledged, it's part of what we're doing, but it's still kind of an appendant, an appendix, an addendum, an afterthought in terms of cyberspace operations. And this, I think, is also a cultural challenge. And another area would be in the information domain, the cognitive space, psychological operations, influence operations, what happens in social media. I think that's actually an entire domain for conflict and competition. But these are annexes, and we think after the fact about how we can use those to support our military operations. We don't think about, I'm conducting an information campaign. How can the kinetic military capabilities support that? And the cultural issue is this, that I say the vast majority, all of our senior leaders in the military grew up in the turret of a tank, cockpit of a fighter, or on the bridge of a carrier. And until we get leaders who grew up with their fingers on keyboards, these kinds of cyber and information operations, I think, are going to be an afterthought for a long time. Now, not quite that extreme, because there are some brilliant people who are four-star generals who think more expansively, but too little of the force does, and it tends to be, again, an appendum and an annex, and it's not what we think about first.
Great. And definitely don't apologize for the anecdotes, because that's why it's so great to have you here, because you're giving so much more than we get out of our journal articles and books. So we love it. Mm-hmm. Moving into sort of some questions about career advice. What are for students who are looking to pursue a career in intelligence, but are maybe just coming straight from an academic background, what are some experiences or characteristics or maybe relevant job experience that they should highlight if they want to pursue a career in intelligence?
Yeah, I'm sorry I don't have great advice on this. It is tough. It is too tough to crack into the intelligence community in the United States. And really, I think that it's the clearance that's a barrier. There's such a preference for people who already have a clearance that it can be challenging for bright, talented people to get in if they don't have a clearance. And it's one of my soapboxes and something I'm trying to work in the United States, because I think we narrow the scope of talent, that we're ignoring a lot of talent when we just look at people who already have clearances. And I have not been very successful in shortcutting that challenge. But in terms of what I look for, I'll tell you what I look for in an intelligence professional. So, of course, you have to have certain cognitive abilities, clear, logical thinking, an ability to connect the dots of information that's coming from disparate sources. And also you have to be a good communicator, both orally and written, or at least one of those two, because ultimately, if you're not able to convey your idea and analysis, if you're not able to compel we don't do intelligence for its own sake. It's for someone else to use it. And if you can't convey your ideas, all your work is for naught, or if it's not trusted. The key capabilities that I look for in intelligence professionals is an insatiable sense of curiosity. And I find the best intel analysts are insatiably curious. And every time, you turn over a rock and get an answer, it generates 5 more questions. That's, never satisfied, always thinking, insatiably curious. And then as a result of that insatiable curiosity, engaged in a relentless pursuit of knowledge. You never know it all. And in fact, sometimes there are certain areas where I kind of reluctantly talk to the old guy or gal that's been looking at something for decades, because sometimes their ideas are fixed, and it's hard to, they can be quite subject to confirmation bias, at any rate. And then a third one that I would say, insatiably curious, relentlessly pursuing knowledge, persistently networking. This is ultimately a human endeavor. And despite all the machines and technology, and the more people and places that you know to go for answers or to share your own answers. So networking sometimes has negative connotations. I don't mean it in any of those ways. Every week I challenge myself, even in retirement, that I'm going to add, actually some days I do it every day, new people to my Rolodex that I can call on for information. And then finally, you've got to be the consummate team player, because this is the ultimate team sport. And any intel agency or organization or military unit that thinks they're going to do it all by themselves is delusional or inexperienced, because it really is a team sport. And so you got to be a team player. You can't be parochial about your interests in your unit. You can't be too proud to put someone else's products in the read book for your boss. You've got to be the consummate team player. I don't know if any of those will help you get a job, but once you have a clearance, those are the things that would make me want to hire you. Unless, of course, you're in a field that doesn't require a clearance, which we have some.
And kind of going off, like reflecting on like the earlier stages of your career, do you have any advice, or was there a key lesson that you learned that you'd be willing to share with us?
Well, I think I've shared a few. I can tell you about some of my colossal mistakes, where I learned like, double check, rehearse what you're doing. Gosh, that's when I should have been, trust me, I've made plenty of mistakes. That's when I should have been primed to kind of answer. And I'm sorry that I don't have a ready anecdote with that. You could watch me think for about 2 minutes and I'll come up with one, but our time is perhaps better used in discussion.
That's all right. Sorry. So if you were in the room with President Joe Biden, what would be like one thing, like either the intelligence concern or something you'd want him to understand about the intelligence community? Like, what's the most important thing you'd want to convey to him?
Sure. I would say kind of great power competition, readiness of our community to work with our partners and allies, which he is firmly committed to work with our partners and allies to cooperate and compete with Russia, China. There's a couple pieces to this. One, he already knows this. It is not just about competition. It is a spectrum of cooperation, competition, and conflict. And there are areas where we need to cooperate, like climate change, pandemics, global health issues. There are areas where we're going to compete, for influence, economically, et cetera, and we have to be prepared for conflict. Okay, but he already knows that. On the conflict piece, I used to think, 3 things. I used to think a lot, I still think about, I would reflect on or speak about in detail what it took to defeat ISIS. Operating from, reconnaissance aircraft, 90% of DOD's reconnaissance aircraft operating from bases in Turkey, on Cyprus, in Jordan, off ships in the Med or in the Gulf, Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, encircling little, Iraq, Syria, 90% of our ISR. That's not scalable to China. And that's just one aspect of it. We cannot scale to conflict with China. One, you can't surround it geographically like that. 2, the range of aircraft is insufficient to reach targets of interest. So we have to find a way to leverage overhead and unclassified and conventional collection to get those insights. 2, it's just not scalable. So, when I think of of the air campaign that we were conducting against ISIS and all the manpower that was involved in generating each target, say you needed 100 times for that for China, you can't buy 100 times the people. And oh, by the way, bureaucracy. So what we need is 21st century processes, not 20th century and processes that are enhanced or sped up by automation and technology. We need new, different ways of doing things. That's to compete militarily in a conflict with someone like Russia, China, Iran. But more recently, it's come to my awareness that we really have two other key kind of threat areas that we compete every single day. So what I've talked about is the fight we hope never happens, but that we have to prepare for. Every day, we are bleeding information from a counterintelligence and security perspective. And that is largely, but not exclusively, China. And the second one is in the information and influence domain, that you get adversaries like Russia who have optimized the synchronization of intelligence, cyber, and influence operations. And we are real amateurs at this in the United States. We have not taken the Sun Tzu approach at all. And in many ways, I feel like we're looking at a big, powerful, muscular boxer in the corner of the ring whose adversary is just pummeling him every day and he never hits back. And that's us in the information, in the cognitive space, in influence, propaganda, kind of whole of government stuff. I've been harping about the need to change the way we conduct military operations to scale what we did against violent extremist organizations for nation states, without awareness that these are two other areas that we're getting hit at every day that we really need to retool ourselves. So that, I think, is what I would tell President Biden.
Great. And I'm so grateful for how many questions you've been able to get through. We'll do just a few more. So with the trends, particularly in terrorism, kind of shifting, that a lot of our threats are coming from within our borders, would you say there are any lessons or methods that law enforcement could, or in the intelligence community, could be learning from the military intelligence community?
Yes, I think we need to look at, I've been kind of shocked, frankly, the last 18 months watching some of the developments in my own nation. First, I don't want to make this political, but, some of the things that Donald Trump personally did, I said, whoa, when foreign leaders do that, I actually write an intel report that says this is backsliding on democratic norms. So, that was my first shock, but he's not in office right now. But then more recently, I would really say from the summer of 20, as I look at things across the United States, I go, what this, like, when this happens, this is like, some of the social unrest. It reminds me very much of things that we monitor in places like Iraq, right? And so I think there is a lot to be learned about. Think of all the work we put into studying and understanding radicalization, what makes people prone to radicalization, how to de-radicalize or dampen that. And in particular, it's very disturbing to see members of the veteran population, not every veteran, it's a small percentage, but members of the veteran population who've fallen for this QAnon stuff, right? And I think that there are aspects of the veteran community that are uniquely vulnerable to, or find that message appealing. I think that's an area where the military needs to work with civil society and others. So I have a friend, he used to be the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for the Middle East, and he's a career CIA special operative. He's volunteered like, hey, new administration, if you're going to have a commission on radicalization in the military, I would like to be part of that and consult on that because he has done so much work looking at that overseas. I think that, in the wake of 9/11, we stood up the DNI, we reoriented our intelligence community, we created the Department of Homeland Security. It was all optimized for looking at foreign terror threats, shorthand for radical Sunni jihadists, but not just them, but, foreign. I think we need to not rebuild something else, but we take those muscle movements and practices and reorient them with an understanding that there are different legal aspects when you're collecting information on American citizens, but that a lot of that should be postured for a change, not a radical change, but a slight change in azimuth. Those muscle movements and connections are there. It's a different threat. The challenge is that one of the challenges, as I alluded to earlier, in addition to the privacy concerns, and we do have First Amendment rights to speak freely and peaceably assembly. We need to understand when you've crossed a line and it's no longer a legal exercise of that right, and you've entered criminal activity. But also, as I kind of alluded to with this review I'm doing in the U.S. Capitol response, it is very easy to politicize this threat, and that poses a challenge in itself.
Kind of going off the shift you talked about after 9/11. Since then, we've seen intelligence themes play like a bigger role in popular culture. Would you say this has had any impact on the perception of intelligence operations, both by people who consume intelligence as well as those who join operations?
Yes. Hollywood doesn't do us any favors as far as I'm concerned, and I won't watch any of those movies unless it's a total spoof or Daniel Craig. I will watch those. But, they don't do us any favors because they make it look like it is so easy, and it is not. People don't understand the tremendous apparatus that goes into delivering a single report. And the other thing is, it's never a single analyst like it's often portrayed in movies or television. It's a huge team of people that do it. It requires tremendous teamwork, and there's a reason we call it the intelligence enterprise. So I think sometimes perhaps someone who sees how it's also not as glamorous as it looks on television or in the movies, and someone may see that and they think that's what they're going to get, and then you're stuck in a basement somewhere, reading reports on our median railroads and putting together something you think no one's ever going to read. That could be perhaps quite disappointing. I'll just use as one quick example. When we struck Assad's chemical infrastructure in April of 2018, I was very proud of that strike, and my team built the target packages and teed them up for decision. From the time we heard about the attack which was on a Sunday morning, I was brushing my teeth and I heard it on the radio, and then we did the strike on around midnight on Friday night, so it was less than a week. We were able to do that because we already had binders on the shelf of Syria response options. The time to develop options, I guess, back to we're running out of time. 2 points I had wanted to make. There's real art. You've got to be able to anticipate what the commander is going to need before he asks for it. Because you don't wait until something happens and they go, perhaps we'd like to bomb Syria's chemical infrastructure to start work. Some of those had been in the works for years or required, intelligence that folks like the CIA had been working on for years, right? And it was quite an exquisite strike. The UK was part of it, and we struck with munitions from sea and air-launched platforms operating out of the Mediterranean, the Red Sea, and the Persian Gulf, US, UK, and France, multiple combatant commands in the United States, all these rounds impacting 2 target complexes, the Barza Chemical Research Center and a bunker complex. All those rounds hit within a 5-minute window, start to finish, which is pretty cool. And really pretty much demolished those targets we estimated after the fact, loss of life, 7 Syrian security guards. That's pretty precise, right? That takes a whole lot of intel. And I really ticked off the deputy commander at U.S. Central Command afterwards. Because I said, I want to send a certificate of appreciation to all the intel people that were involved in this. NSA, NGA, Defense Threat Reduction Agency, and for nights. I mean, they made this stack. Every night I'd try to sign 20 before I went home, because otherwise I'd get a hand cramp, and it took forever. I mean, hundreds. And I said, I wish I had the time to add up all the intelligence professionals that were involved in that 5-minute strike. And it would be, I guarantee it, in the 4 figures, I said. And then let's count the number of pilots. Well, our DCOM was a pilot. He didn't appreciate that comment. But my point is, it takes a lot of intelligence and a huge team and network of people to develop actionable intelligence. And Hollywood does not reflect that.
Yeah, so it was just one guy in a nice leather jacket taking it all down. I think we'll have one more question and we'll turn it back to Sarah. Do you think that democracy and the intelligence culture of openness is a burden or a benefit for U.S. intelligence?
I think, I think, I mean, it's what we've sworn to uphold and defend. Those darn constitutional freedoms do get in the way, but that's why we're here. So I think, legally, policy-wise, we do have some things to sort through. I have sometimes felt like, as a liberal Western democracy, we're on our hind foot against nations like Russia that may not worry about that, or nations like China that really have a very strong military, industrial, educational, beyond partnership, as opposed to our system where companies can choose to cooperate with the government or not, can innovate in a way that their shareholders see fit. Those are challenges, but they also provide great benefits to our society. And on balance, I think those benefits to society are far more important and are worth the bureaucratic obstacle of having to contend with our competitors who don't have to worry about that kind of stuff. Great question.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you so much, Rachel, for the Q&A session. And thank you, General Gibson, for your answers. And thank you to everyone who popped questions in the chat. There were some really interesting, thought-provoking questions there. I cannot thank you enough, General Gibson. I think many of us have spent a very long time now sat at home, staring at screens, thinking, does anything that I'm doing here make a difference, hoping that one day maybe it will. And listening to you speak this evening, I don't know about everybody else, but it's really given me a boost. It's really inspired me as an Intel student. I just wanted to ask you, I love to ask people this question, and I don't know what I'll do one day if somebody asks it to me, but I would like to ask you, you have a degree in strategic intelligence. So if you could go back and say one thing, one sentence to your student self, knowing what you know now about your career, what would it be?
Stick with it. It's a lot of fun. I think that's what I would, that's very similar to my go for it comment, but, again, I haven't really found anything that I'd rather do. In terms of my academic self, I would be like, hey girl, you need to study, but, do the readings, connect the dots. There's a saying that says it's only a lot of reading if you do it, but I like the one that says you get out of it what you put into it. And I never found, my instructors very thoughtfully, although it seemed like a lot, loading us up on readings. There was always a reason for it. And so do the reading, Gibson. That's what I tell myself.
That's good to know. I think we're all in a similar position at King's. We see books and writing and essays in our sleep, which I think most of us do. Again, thank you so much, General Gibson. We are very privileged to be able to hear from you, and we really appreciate you making the time to speak with us this evening. I'm going to pop our website in the chat here. If you do want a copy of the recording of this evening, do give us an email on the contact us section. We also have some more events coming up, defense, security, international relations, intelligence. So definitely keep an eye on those. We'd love to see you at some of those in the future. Thank you everyone for attending this evening. It's wonderful to see so many of you engaging and getting involved there. And have a very good evening, everyone. Take care. Enjoy the snow if you can, and stay warm. Thank you, General, and goodbye, everybody.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.